Britain in the 1960s gave the world the Mini, the E-Type Jaguar, and the iconic Aston Martin DB5. Absolute legends. Cars that still make grown adults deeply emotional today. But for every icon born in that glorious decade, there was a disaster quietly waiting to happen. A car so deeply flawed, so hopelessly unreliable, or so utterly misguided that it embarrassed the entire nation. Most people only remember the glory. Few remember just how bad things really got. Today on Britain Rewind, we are counting down the 10 worst British cars of the 1960s. Stay for number 1. Because that one was truly unbearable. Now let's start with number 10. Number 10, Sunbeam Rapier Series 4. The Sunbeam Rapier arrived in 1961 dressed entirely for success. It looked genuinely sporty, carried an exciting badge, and promised something every British driver desperately wanted, a real touring experience without breaking the bank. On paper, it looked brilliant. In reality, it absolutely wasn't. The 1.6-litre engine felt more like a formal apology than a performance unit, producing barely enough power to motivate the car, let alone excite its driver. And then came the rust. It arrived faster than regret, eating through the bodywork at a rate that genuinely shocked experienced mechanics across the country. Most people don't know this, but internal Roots Group memos flagged serious quality concerns long before production finally ended, yet nothing meaningfully changed. The gearbox added further misery, routinely jumping out of second gear mid-corner. Sales collapsed not through lack of interest, but through devastating lack of trust. Can you imagine dealing with this daily? Number 9, Austin A40 Farina. The Austin A40 Farina had one genuinely brilliant thing, its name. Styled by Italian design house Pininfarina, it arrived in 1958 and carried through the early 1960s wearing continental fashion on decidedly British bones. It sounded exciting. It really wasn't. Underneath that stylish exterior lived a 948 cubic centimeters engine so breathlessly asthmatic it struggled to keep pace with a determined cyclist on any meaningful gradient. Heating was nearly non-existent, which in Britain's relentlessly damp climate wasn't a minor inconvenience, it was a genuine daily ordeal. But this wasn't even the worst problem. The rear suspension geometry encouraged vicious oversteer in wet conditions, which in Britain effectively meant almost every single drive. Owners frequently reported the car feeling fundamentally unsafe at ordinary speeds. Few people remember how poorly regarded it became among mechanics routinely asked to service them. BMC quietly moved on, barely acknowledging how badly it had let British drivers down. Number 8, Wolseley 1100. The Wolseley 1100 was supposed to be the sophisticated choice in the BMC range. Launched in 1965, it wore chrome trim, genuine leather seating, and a walnut dashboard, all the visual cues of a proper gentleman's saloon. It looked every inch the refined family car. But that's where things started to fall apart spectacularly. Beneath that polished surface lived the same troubled hydroelastic suspension system plaguing many BMC products of the era, prone to gradual deflation that converted a comfortable ride into something catastrophic, sometimes overnight. The electrical system, serviced by components infamous for chronic unreliability, failed with almost theatrical regularity. Interior dampness became so persistent that owners developed personal rituals for drying their seats each morning. Most people don't realize the Wolseley 1100 faded into obscurity because buyers simply stopped recommending it. It sold, suffered quietly, and disappeared, leaving its owners with repair bills exceeding the car's actual value. Number 7, Morris Oxford Series 6. The Morris Oxford Series 6 arrived in 1961 looking like a styling committee had lost an argument mid-meeting. It blended American-influenced tail fins with British conservatism, achieving neither convincingly. It promised solid family practicality, and on that front it sort of delivered, as long as you never expected enthusiasm from anything beneath the bonnet. The B-Series 1.6-litre engine was thoroughly exhausted by 1961, offering acceleration that felt more apologetic than automotive. Fuel consumption was poor for what was delivered. The ride was vague in corners and wallowing on straights. But what owners discovered later was far worse. Rust progressed through the floor pan and sill sections at a rate that made structural inspections almost immediately necessary on any example over 3 years old. Mechanics privately described the Oxford as among their least favorite cars to service. Few remember just how quickly these fell apart. Stick around, it gets considerably worse. Number 6. Humber Sceptre Mark I. The Humber Sceptre Mark I arrived in 1963 with enormous promise. Humber had a distinguished name, decades of heritage, and a reputation for building solid, dependable British motorcars. The Sceptre was supposed to carry that proud tradition forward into the swinging decade. Twin carburetors, a sporting specification, and striking badges suggested real performance ambition. But that's where things began unraveling. The body was fundamentally derived from the Hillman Superminx, a reality no amount of chrome could disguise. Performance barely justified the sporty positioning. The interior quality, while pleasant initially, deteriorated with alarming speed. Most people don't know this, but period press reviews diplomatically suggested buyers look elsewhere for their money. The brakes required significant forewarning before responding with any conviction. Electrical faults arrived reliably and early. Few remember how thoroughly the Sceptre damaged Humber's credibility in the Mark's final decade. Would you have trusted it on British winter roads? Number 5. Vauxhall Victor FB. The Vauxhall Victor FB was the second generation of a car that had already seriously damaged Vauxhall's reputation, which takes genuine commitment to achieve. The original 1957 Victor had rusted so catastrophically it became a national punchline. So in 1961, the FB arrived with promises of improvement, refinement, and durability. Most people don't know this, but the rust returned with absolutely identical enthusiasm, despite the redesigned body. Within 2 British winters, Victors dissolved from the outside inward, leaving vehicles mechanics refused to service without disclaimers. The monocoque body offered inadequate protection against moisture, and in Britain, moisture is never a lifestyle choice. Interior quality suggested cost-cutting at every junction. The column gear change was impressively imprecise, an act of engineering optimism rather than conviction. And what came later was worse still, insurers quietly began declining renewal on older examples. Reliability wasn't just poor. It was spectacular in entirely the wrong direction. Number 4. Triumph Herald. The Triumph Herald arrived in 1959 making headlines for something genuinely impressive, a turning circle tighter than a London black cab. Brilliant, the press agreed. Giovanni Michelotti's styling was charming, and that separate chassis gave it genuine character. But that character concealed something troubling. The body-on-frame construction enabling such a remarkable turning circle also created serious structural rigidity problems. On rough British roads, and in the early 60s, they were rough, the Herald flexed noticeably. At speed, swing axle rear suspension delivered handling characteristics described, politely, as lively. Less politely, they were dangerous. Period road tests noted alarming oversteer that caught inexperienced drivers completely off guard. But this wasn't even the worst problem. Separate body panels, poorly sealed at the frame, trapped moisture in impossible-to-reach places, creating corrosion within the structural sections themselves. Few remember how compromised many early Heralds became, or how quickly. This is the part history often ignores. Number 3. Equipe GT. If you've never heard of the Equipe GT, that alone tells you almost everything. Launched in 1963 by Preston-based Bond Cars Limited, it promised an affordable British sports car dream, sleek glass fiber coachwork over Triumph Herald mechanicals, offering the look of a Grand Tourer at a modest price. On paper, it sounded genuinely exciting. In practice, every single problem from the Herald transferred directly across. The glass fiber body, while theoretically rust-free, was constructed to standards charitably described as approximate. Panel gaps wide enough to post letters through were distressingly common. Wind noise at any meaningful speed turned every motorway journey into an endurance event. The interior felt like an experiment rather than a finished product. Most people don't know this, but total Equipe GT production was so minuscule it barely registered in official sales figures. And what happened next completely damaged any remaining buyer confidence. Nobody wanted one. Number 2. Reliant Regal. The Reliant Regal. 3 wheels. 1 driven at the front. The concept was audacious, the execution alarming, and the experience something few survivors discussed in polite company. The Regal was classified as a tricycle, requiring only a motorcycle license, almost reasonable until you remembered it attempted motorway speeds in a fully enclosed body. The fiberglass shell provided zero meaningful structural protection in any realistic crash scenario. The single front wheel, handling both steering and driving duties, created dynamics that rewarded absolutely no complacency. Wet roads transformed the experience from unpleasant to genuinely hazardous. Most people don't know this, but insurers privately flagged these vehicles as elevated risk. The 700 cubic centimeters engine produced sounds far more dramatic than the performance it actually delivered. Fuel economy was the Regal's sole genuine virtue. But even that couldn't begin to justify everything else. Stick around for number 1. The Regal almost looks sensible by comparison. Number 1. Hillman Imp. And here we are. Number 1. The Hillman Imp, Britain's most expensive automotive disaster of the 1960s. Launched in 1963 as a direct mini competitor. It promised rear-engine innovation, a clever aluminium unit derived from a Coventry Climax engine, and genuine modernity. Instead, it delivered a masterclass in how political decisions destroy engineering realities. The Lingwood factory in Scotland was built under government pressure rather than logistical sense, employing workers with no automotive experience. The all-aluminium engine overheated chronically. The automatic choke failed so regularly that owners carried tools as standard equipment. Head gaskets lasted months rather than years. Water leaks, electrical failures, and carburetor issues created a perfect storm of daily misery. Roots Group lost enormous sums attempting to fix problems they created themselves. Few remember how catastrophically this damaged its manufacturer. The Hillman Imp didn't just fail its owners. It helped destroy an entire British brand. Truly unbearable. The 1960s was a decade of extraordinary promise for British motoring. But promise, as these 10 cars proved, means nothing without proper engineering and genuine commitment to the driver. Every car here represented a failure of expectation, a gap between what was advertised and what was actually delivered. Most people only remember the icons. Now you know the other side of that decade. If you enjoy the real, unvarnished truth behind Britain's automotive history, subscribe to Britain Rewind and never miss a story. And here's a question for you: which would you absolutely refuse to own? Tell us down below. We'll see you in the next amazing video.